Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library Podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to the stories that matter here on the North Fork and sometimes far beyond. Some of our guests are rooted here by generations. Others join us from elsewhere to share their work, their perspective, or their connection to this community, but all bring something that resonates, something that adds to the ongoing conversation. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 241, we sit down with New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, one of New York's longest-serving statewide elected officials. Since taking office in 2007, Comptroller DiNapoli has overseen the state's finances, safeguarded the New York State's Common Retirement Fund, conducted audits of state agencies and local governments, and worked to promote transparency, accountability, and fiscal responsibility across New York. A lifelong public servant, Comptroller DiNapoli began his career in New York State Assembly, where he served for more than 2 decades before being elected comptroller. Throughout his years in public office, he has worked with communities, large and small, gaining a first-hand understanding of the challenges, opportunities facing New Yorkers in every corner of the state. In our conversation, we begin with his early life and experiences that inspired his commitment to public service before exploring the role of the state comptroller and its impact on everyday New Yorkers. We also discuss the future of local communities, the importance of transparency in government, the vital role public libraries play in civic life, what continues to give him hope for the future of New York State. So I hope you enjoy episode 241 with Tom DiNapoli. This episode was recorded July 29th, 2026. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Floyd Memorial Library Podcast today. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
It is my pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thank you. And so in the beginning with our local podcast out here, I'd just like to start off, before we talk about your role as New York State Comptroller, could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what your early experiences were like?
Sure. I am born and raised Long Islander, Nassau County. Apologies to my Suffolk County friends, but I do love I do love Greenport. I want to be clear. When I was a kid, one of our favorite spots to drive out to for my parents was to bring us to Claudio's back in the old days. So I'm very familiar with Greenport over the years. So I was born in Rockville Center, Nassau County Mercy Hospital. My family home was in Albertson, which is just south of Roslyn, because Roslyn was actually the town where my parents were born and raised. So our family roots, you could tell by the name, go back to Italy. Chris, you're familiar with names like we have.
Yes.
And my grandparents, both sets of grandparents, settled in Brooklyn first, met and married, but actually moved out to Long Island back, around, I guess, right around First World War. So, I had that experience where both of my parents were born and raised on Long Island in Roslyn. They actually knew each other all their lives. So unlike a lot of my friends when I was growing up who had moved out from Brooklyn or Queens, my family was out there, and I was out there the whole time. So I grew up and went to public schools, many old public schools, and had the great experience of growing up on Long Island I was born in the 50s, came of age in the 60s and the early 70s. Long Island certainly then was, the booming first suburb in the United States. So a lot of great things going on. And I'll just fast forward. Graduating high school, I chose to stay on Long Island, and I went to Hofstra as a commuter student. I think, as you may know from my bio, I was very active in school affairs in Mineola, and ended up running for a seat on the Board of Education when I was still a senior in high school. So I have that unique distinction of being the first 18-year-old elected to anything in New York. And some others have followed in my footsteps, but I'm still the first 18-year-old. So I was commuting to Hofstra, studying history and serving on the school board, and then got involved in democratic politics along the way, and that's obviously the journey that I've still been on.
Yes. Was that something you knew coming out of high school you wanted to get into more of the political side of
Well,
like were you
more than
interested?
ask that question, I would say this, so I graduated high school in 1972. So, coming of age in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot going on. Very divided country, very polarized, not too not too different than today, different issues, but same dynamic. But I grew up in a pretty conservative neighborhood, pretty conservative family. My family were all Republicans. And sitting in front of the TV as a student in junior high and high school, the backdrop of those years was, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the beginning of the environment movement, right? The first Earth Day happened when I was in high school. The beginnings of what was then called the gay liberation movement, all these movements. And then, of course, besides civil rights, I think the defining issue of that era was the Vietnam War. And, remembering that back then, we had a draft, which applied only to young men. 18 years old, you could be drafted, and many were killed, right? Over 50,000 Americans were killed in that war. So one of the activities I got involved with was the moratoriums and protesting against the war and fighting for the 18-year-old vote, because you had to be 21 to vote back then, but 18 to be drafted. So many of us felt, we could be drafted and sent off overseas to fight in a war that we don't support. We should have a say in what's going on. We've reversed it now, so you can be 18 to vote, but back then, if you were 18, you could buy a drink. Now you have to be 21 to buy a drink. So we
Yes.
we flipped some of those eligibilities. So I would say that I felt, watching what was happening, I felt there had to be a better way, and I certainly began to view political activity and being involved with government as a solution to the problems. And I particularly, the voices that resonated inside of me were, John Kennedy when I was very young, Bobby Kennedy when he was running for president. He was assassinated when I was in junior high, and President Kennedy was assassinated when I was in fourth grade. I can remember those days, and
Yes.
obviously Martin Luther King was a very important influence. He also was assassinated the same year as Bobby Kennedy. So, me, I felt, we needed to do things better, and government politics was a way to do it. Being someone very focused on local, that's why my first involvement was with the Board of Education, because I used to go to school board meetings. I was student organization president. I didn't like some of the things happening. And I kind of took the civic lesson seriously. Some of my friends believed in protesting and dropping out of the system, right? The system is no good. Anybody over 30 you can't trust, that those kind of slogans from those days. Some of that's coming back again. And I was of the opinion, well, the system says we can have input, we can have a say, we can have a seat at the table. So why not take advantage of that? That experience I mentioned earlier of running for the school board, but I also had another version to explain of that experience. My very first vote was for myself. How many people can say that? And I voted for myself, and when the polls closed, turns out I won. So at a very early age, I had a sense that you can be successful if you put yourself out there and have something to say that people might in fact trust you, even if you're an 18-year-old with, picture me with long dark hair and jeans and knocking on doors. So that always gave me an optimistic sense that political activity was a way to make a difference. And that being said, especially back in the early years, being a Democrat in Nassau County was not exactly fertile opportunity, to run for office. So actually, I worked in the private sector for 10 years. I went at night and got my master's. I was working in Manhattan the last few years for AT&T, that little telephone company that's still
Yes.
around. But I kind of migrated from school board politics to Democratic politics, ran unsuccessfully for town office in those early years in my 20s, and had then moved to Great Neck somewhere along the way, mostly for the train, because the Port Washington train line is a great way to get to Manhattan, as
Yes.
opposed to the Oyster Bay line that I lived on originally. And then I had an unexpected opportunity when May Newberger, who was a longtime assembly member for my area, my new home area, decided not to seek reelection. And because I had been involved in the party and had been a candidate and certainly had 10 year. I was on school board for 10 years,
Hmm.
including 2 terms as president. And I worked for a period of time, part-time, for a Suffolk County fellow by the name of Bob Mrazek. I don't know if you remember that name, but
Yes.
Bob Mrazek was a Suffolk County legislator who ran for Congress in 1982, represented Nassau and Suffolk County. And that year I had run for town supervisor. I didn't win, but I got to know Bob, and he asked me to be one of his part-time district representatives to cover Nassau County for him. So I had always kept my finger in the politics, even though I was working in the private sector. And so when I had the chance to compete for the Democratic nomination for state assembly, I did. And fortunately for me, I was able to be nominated, and then was in the assembly, I think, as you know, for 2 decades. So
Yes.
represented Northwest Nassau County, so Great Neck, Port Washington, Roslyn,
Hmm.
Alberton, part of Mineola, some of, so the kind of the area where I grew up and where my family was from. That was a real privilege to represent, neighborhoods that really
Hmm.
all my life I had been a part of. But yeah, to me, making a difference, and I think there are different ways people can make a difference. I always say to especially younger people, you don't necessarily have to do what I did and run for office. That's not for everybody, but certainly civic engagement, something as simple as going to the village board meeting or the town board meeting, the school board meeting, and being involved in committees.
Hmm.
We fought for a budget advisory committee, and there were curriculum committees and so on at the school level.
Hmm.
I always say there are many ways you could be involved. You could help other people who are running for office if you don't want to be a
Hmm.
candidate yourself. You could have a career in government, certainly running the Comptroller's office, which is a 3,000 person state agency. There are many
Hmm.
wonderful careers in government that don't require you to go before voters and
Hmm.
have to get elected, or be involved in the party. A lot of people
Yes.
today, especially younger people, don't want to be in a political party. And I think you lose some of your
Mm.
leverage, by not being affiliated. So whether you're Republican or Democrat, I think you have double the influence if you're active in a party. So yeah,
Hmm.
so I still believe strongly that we can be better as a community,
Hmm.
civic engagement through the political process.
Yes. No, and like you've mentioned, you've spent decades serving New York with the state assembly and now comptroller, but you also mentioned you worked a little bit outside, like with AT&T, but what do you think really inspired you to dedicate your career to public service through this whole time?
It's an interesting question because when I worked in the private sector, I enjoyed it.
Hmm.
And I got my master's in management, human resources and labor relations was kind of the area of focus. I really saw myself focusing on that. My father wanted me to be a lawyer. That's not really what I wanted to do, but
Hmm.
I did, especially when that assembly nomination became available. I remember I called Bob Mrazek up. He was still in Congress at that point, and I said, Bob, what do you think I should do? Should I, I just recently gotten promoted. I had a job I really wanted and liked in the private sector. And he said, look, he said, I can't tell you what to do, but if you think you want to do politics, this is your opportunity. And opportunities don't come along too often where there's an open seat, probably one that's competitive for a Democrat. And so I had to do just a lot of internal soul searching. And my parents thought I was crazy because there's not much job security when you're running for assembly and you're up every 2 years versus, working for a big company. Of course, the company went through a lot of changes, so there aren't too many people left that I knew,
Yes.
after divestiture and relocation and downsizing and, anyway, but
Yes.
I've never really looked back. So from my perspective, I think that early inspiration that I had as a kind of a bewildered teenager, confused about what was happening in the world and feeling that there had to be a better way,
Hmm.
that always stuck with me. And I think that much as I liked working in the private sector, at the end of the day, helping a big corporation do its mission was not as important to me as being an advocate for my community and for the issues that I
Hmm.
care about. And
Yes.
my experience in government has been working with fabulous people. And I'm not saying it's always been pretty or perfect, and not without its own challenges and disappointments. But on balance, the
Hmm.
reason I'm still in it and still trying to be in it is that I can't think of anything more important or anything else that I'd like to do. And I still think, given the challenges of today, right? And there's the issues are different, but the parallels to when I was coming of age in terms of divisions, polarization, just seeming that people don't know how to bridge divides. We're at that same point right now.
Yes.
So I'd like to think that my style, which is probably a little different than some of the other folks these days, that
Mhm.
that could be a style that is a little more, inclusive and a little less. I'm not known for engaging in hyperbole or, crazy rhetoric, and I think that's important, especially for the controller job, given the work that we
Mhm.
do. I'm hoping that helps to be a positive influence in terms of New York State government, anyway.
Yes. I know, and just for our listeners who may not be familiar with the role of the New York State Comptroller, could you explain what your office does and how it might impact the everyday lives of New Yorkers?
Chris, that's a question I get asked the most, right?
Yeah.
People hear controller and they're not quite sure what it is. Is it comptroller, controller? How do you even
Com,
pronounce it?
yeah.
I mean, technically it's comp, C-O-M-P, but most
Com,
people pronounce it as con, although legally, on the ballot it's comptroller with the C-O-M-P from the French for computing. So,
mm,
I mean, it's an office that in many other states is divided up between different offices, some appointed, some elected. In New York, we've kind of pulled together the role of chief financial auditor, state auditor, pension fund management, all under the umbrella of the controller. So the office goes back to 1797. It's been around a long time. The first controller was a fellow by the name of Samuel Jones. I don't expect you to know that name, but I know you know his family's property on the South Shore of Long Island that eventually became Jones Beach.
mm,
It's a little bit of
yes.
history of, and until I became appointed controller in 2007, no other Long Islanders had the position. So it took us a couple hundred years to get it back. So serving as chief fiscal officer means a couple of things. We have an oversight role with the state budget. We don't create the state budget, right? That's done by the legislature and the governor. After they put the budget together, though, we follow the money. So we do audits of payments, we approve contracts, we make sure the state employees get paid, we make sure vendors and those folks doing business with the state get paid. We make sure nonprofits get their state grants. We make sure local governments get their state aid. So making sure that the business of New York state government is happening is a very key part of the state controls office. I say we're like the back office operation,
Mhm.
especially that contract review role is an independent oversight role to make sure that when an agency puts out a contract, that the taxpayers in the state are getting the best value. We manage the state pension fund, so we invest the money, $300 billion fund, one of the largest investment funds, certainly one of the largest public pension funds in the country, if not the world. And that money is invested to provide the retirement security for the 1.3 million New Yorkers who are public employees and are members of our pension system. So we do the investing, and then we also do the benefit administration.
Mhm.
We
Yes.
also have another accountability role. I say we're the Office of Transparency and Accountability. So we have an audit function. We have a number of our employees are in the audit divisions. We have two audit divisions. We have the State Government Accountability Division that audits state agencies, public authorities like the MTA. Then we have our local government and school district accountability division. They do audits of towns, cities, villages, school districts, special districts. So
Mhm.
that's auditing at the local level and auditing the state agencies. Again, making sure money's not being wasted. In the most extreme cases, we sometimes people stealing public money. Then we have an investigations division, part of our counsel's office that works with law enforcement. We can't indict anybody, but we can work with DAs and the attorney, with Tish James's office, the attorney general, the U.S. attorneys, hold people accountable. We do
Mhm.
some miscellaneous things. We administer the state's 529 college savings program, the New York ABLE program, which is a savings program for people with disabilities. We help administer the oil spill fund that helps clean up sites that need to be remediated. And then the most fun thing we do is return people's lost money, unclaimed funds, old bank accounts, checks that weren't cashed. It's called unclaimed funds turned over to us. And we try to find the rightful owners and return that money to them. We're returning Oh, now we're probably turning about $2 million a day to people in lost money.
Wow.
It's kind of a fun thing that we do.
Yes.
So it's a lot of different things, right? That's part
Yes,
of, I
there's a
think, why people don't know when they hear controller, they're not sure what it is because they don't realize a lot of it's maybe a little bit below the surface of what people see, but it's what makes the job interesting. We have a lot of depth and breadth to the work that we do.
hmm And like you said, you're working with a lot of different communities and uh, what do you think are some of the qualities that make the local communities in New York unique when you're working with them?
Well, New York is such a big and diverse state. I thought I knew a lot when I was serving the assembly. I obviously knew Long Island pretty well. Living in Nassau, you kind of know the city. And being in Albany for as many years as I was, I kind of got to know some things about upstate. But I've had such a different perspective now being controller because my focus is statewide, and I
hmm
really appreciate now just the tremendous diversity between the more rural areas of the state, and we have many rural communities, and the very urbanized area, whether it's New York City or some of the
hmm
the cities upstate, and certainly the uniqueness of the suburbs, be it Westchester or Rockland or Nassau or Suffolk. It's what makes serving in state office interesting, but also more challenging because it's very hard to come up with solutions that are kind of one size fits all.
hmm
So, I remember this when I was in the legislature. So, whether you're talking about legislation that has a statewide impact or a budget issue, sometimes it's very hard to come up with solutions that everybody's happy with because you really need a statewide impact, and
hmm
so I think that's always one of the challenges. So what we try to do, certainly in our office, when we do our policy reports or we do reports on different issues that are out there, we try to also drill down on what's happening, at a regional basis, at a more local level. Because although we always report the big numbers for New York State on the economy, on revenue, and so on, when you really drill down, it's often a very different picture in terms of what's happening in the city versus the island versus, small counties upstate. So we've tried to highlight, the different issues. For instance,
hmm
we've done a series of reports of late on rural New York, where there are some real challenges in terms of population decline and older population being, left behind, needing more services.
hmm
Despite all those differences, Chris, I will also say that there's a lot of commonality in terms of the issues. Wherever I go, housing is an issue, right? We know it's
hmm
an issue on Long Island because of the high cost and certainly in terms of buying a home, not a lot available. You go upstate, maybe the economics are different, price of a home may be different,
hmm
but the challenge of still of affording home ownership
hmm
is still there. We certainly know the city, that's a very, very hot topic as well. And some
hmm
of those issues, the state can play a better role, a stronger role. And the governor, I think, has tried to do that as part of, some of her budget proposals. Some of it's beyond our control. An issue like mortgage rates. Obviously, we don't control
hmm
that in New York State, so we can try to influence, some of these issues. I have to say, wherever you are in New York, even though some of the specifics may vary, the environment is still a very important issue to people. Certainly here
hmm
on the island, we know how important the drinking water supply is, and you may remember, for my Suffolk friends, probably my proudest legislative achievement was sponsoring the Pine Barrens Protection Act, along with Senator Ken LaValle, who represented Greenport,
hmm
as you remember,
Yes.
to help protect that important watershed. But people ask me what was my most significant legislative accomplishment. It was protecting the Pine Barrens and helping set
hmm
up the Environmental Protection Fund and the Community Preservation Fund that's really benefited the East End
Yes.
as well. So even though I'm a Nassau guy, we did a lot to help the East End.
I
So,
hear.
some there's commonality. I mean, it plays out differently in different communities, but and schools, I would say people are
Hmm
across the state are always very concerned about the quality of education, access to education. So yeah, are there regional differences? Absolutely. But I also find some unifying threads in terms of what many of the key issues are.
hmm Yes. No. Look, just like I was going to say with the North Fork, many of our residents are talking about issues like housing, affordability, preserving the community or managing growth. But I have known some people that have moved upstate just because of the challenges for affordability.
Yeah.
So that's been a challenge. And you said you visited out here as a child, and you've probably seen. this area change over the last 30 years or so?
Oh, I mean, look, I still think I was in Cutchogue not that long ago, and
Hmm.
driving out there, the North Fork, even I think, no offense to the South Fork, has still retained a bit more of that
Hmm.
oral feel.
Yes.
But I know it's under threat, right? So you see some of the farms or the big sod farms as well, and then you'll see a new
Hmm.
development
Hmm.
that's underway, or Greenport even. I remember Greenport is kind of a very laid back, little fishing village, with
Yes.
Claudio's and a couple of shops. Now got some chic and trendy restaurants.
Yes.
Look at Montauk. We'll talk South Fork. Montauk is
Yes.
very different. We used to ride out to Gossman's Dock and watch the fishing boats come in.
Hmm.
It's a different flavor now. Not that I get out to Montauk that much, but I know it's different because look, people discovered it and it's a beautiful area. So the challenge is how do you retain that character, and especially for people who've been longtime residents. One of the things we did, because we focus on agriculture as one of the areas that we report on a regular basis. And I think it was our last ag report, we did a special section on Long Island farms because agriculture is a big issue across the state. But the dynamic on Long Island, because it's a different mix in terms of what the agricultural products are, and the economics are very different. The development pressures are different as well. We did a real focus on some of the challenges as far as those issues of labor force as well. All of this complicated of late, with the immigration policies from the federal administration. So we always try to give voice, and given my own, roots on Long Island, it's rare that a Long Islander is in a statewide office. It doesn't happen too often. Politics in New York tend to be driven by upstate or New York City.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I feel sometimes Long Island becomes the afterthought. So, I've told our folks, on agriculture issues, Long Island has its own dynamic, and we need to amplify what some of the problems and the concerns are. I would just say that's part of why, especially for the North Fork, the Pine Barrens work, the Community Preservation Fund, and Fred Thiel kind of picked up the mantle after
Hmm.
after I left the assembly, has been helpful in terms of preservation. I think even in terms of some housing as well.
Hmm.
But the pressures on the North Fork are real, and again, because of the desirability of the area,
Hmm.
it's still going to be a challenge.
Yes. No, definitely. Um, and you've mentioned just with your office, the transparency and public trust are central to the work you do. Why is access to information so important in maintaining trust between the government and the people it serves?
Well, I think people generally are rightfully skeptical about what they
Hmm.
hear in government, and I think one of the challenges of today is that we don't have a common source of information or news or facts, and I
Hmm.
think that's one of the negatives about the time we live in. People tend to source their information from places that are kind of predisposed to their own point of view.
Hmm.
When I was growing up, you had three networks, and they all kind of said the same thing. And you had your favorite was Walter Cronkite or Huntley Brinkley or whoever. I'm forgetting who the third network leading person was. You kind of trusted them. You might disagree with somebody on the facts, but on your interpretation of the facts, but you didn't disagree on the facts. Now we don't even agree on the facts anymore.
Hmm.
So trying to provide credibility in terms of information, I think, is important. So we always strive very hard to keep the tradition of the controller's office being the least partisan of all the offices out there. And our staff are by and large civil service people. They're Republicans and Democrats. They're not hired based on their political affiliation. And we try to promote transparency with the data that we have. We collect a lot of information, a lot of data. One of the things we set up early on, and we're always enhancing it and expanding it, is something called Open Book New York, which is basically having the state's checkbook open so people could see how much money is being spent on what programs, what contracts are going out the door, both for state agencies and for local government as well. And that's very user friendly. People go to our website, click on Open Book New York, and you can find this data. And that's not done without any interpretation. It's just putting the data out there. So I do think that everything that we can do, and that's really where the audit function comes in as well, in terms of
Hmm.
giving information. So we strive to provide. Look, I have a point of view on things, right? I'm not saying I don't, but
Hmm.
we strive very hard with the analysis we put out to really be objective and to really, state the facts. And then, whatever the public discourse will be, people will come to their own conclusions. But it
Mhm,
is a challenge because I think people are much less trusting of government
mhm.
generally. And unfortunately, I think social media, I hate to sound like everybody else and say social media is,
Yes.
doing so many bad things, but social media is doing so many bad things because,
Yes.
somebody reads something online and they believe it. It could be the
Mhm.
craziest thing in the world, but it's unfortunately sometimes just people feel it has credibility even when it shouldn't. So
Mhm.
I think it's even more important for us to strive to be as objective and responsible in the information we put out.
Yes. And I also just wanted to touch on libraries because this is a library podcast. Libraries have been very important in communities as a public space, a community center. But what role do you think public libraries play in strengthening civic life and bringing people together?
Well, I think they always played an important role. I used to do community forums and town halls at the libraries, in my
Hmm.
assembly district. And certainly what I've seen, great programs in terms of discussions and civic engagement. You're absolutely right. The first few years I was in the assembly, one of the people I sat next, I had a seat in the middle of the aisle. There was in the middle of the row rather. There were two aisle seats and me in the middle. It was a three-person row. And on my left side was a woman who had been a librarian in New York City, Cynthia Jenkins, before she was a member of the state assembly. And whenever questions came up about funding for libraries, Cynthia would always stand up and say, "We're not providing enough resources for our libraries." And she had a very interesting phrase that always stuck with me. And I think it's so true. You can't have quality education if you don't have quality libraries.
Hmm.
And I think besides the very important community role in terms of civic engagement, and that is very important to be a welcoming and neutral public space, I think the important role that the libraries play in education, and it always stuck with me. And I remember, gee, I used to go to the Shelter Rock Library when I had to do a term paper. And even when I was in college, while I used the Hofstra Library, I also went to my local public library a great
Hmm.
deal. And so I think the investment in our libraries is so very, very important. I would say I don't think it's been a big issue on Long Island, but I have been concerned at times. You've seen in some of the library board elections, they've gotten a little too politicized. And I think, there have been some challenges as far as free speech in ways that have been troubling. Again, I don't think that's been a huge issue on Long Island, but
Hmm.
in some communities, it's been an issue about which books should be there or shouldn't be there, which speakers should be allowed in, shouldn't be allowed
Hmm.
in. I think, my bias always is freedom of thought, provide the greatest opportunity for diverse points of view.
Hmm.
Again, I think by and large on Long Island, our libraries have been very responsible and appropriately responsive to community concerns. But I also think that it's so important that we equate funding for our libraries really in the same way that we put a focus on funding for our public schools as well.
Hmm. Yes, definitely. And you might have touched on this already, but just looking back at your years in public service, what are some of the lessons you've learned from people and communities you have met across New York?
I would say, contrary to what some people may think, most of the folks who are involved, and I don't necessarily mean elected officials, people involved in community issues are sincere and genuine and really are trying to make their community better. Even if there may be disagreements, I think sometimes too many people cast negative aspersions on people with a different point of view.
Hmm.
My experience has been that you kind of have to take people where they are. Don't read ulterior motives into a point of view that somebody has. So I guess, for me as someone who, continues to want to be involved as an elected official, I have my big takeaway is that people are basically good and want to do better for their community. And we should accept, even if they're challenged, right? Sometimes people challenge me on an issue or they don't like something in an audit or they think we should audit something we didn't look at. I don't take criticisms as, a personal attack. I mean, in a political campaign, sometimes they're personal attacks. that's a different question. But I would say my big takeaway is that most, 99% of the people you're going to deal with are very, very positive and are just trying to do the right thing. That being said, having run in many campaigns over many years, I think the environment generally in 2026 is a lot more confrontational, in terms
Hmm.
of the political stage. Certainly, I just went through a primary in New York State, and there was a lot more negativity out there than I would have expected there to be. But I think that's reflective of just the very polarized time that we're in and just how jaded so many people are. And
Hmm.
in some ways, the oversimplification of some of the issues that are out there in a way that doesn't lend itself to the kind of thoughtful discussion, frankly, that I am more familiar with. And I think
Hmm.
the better way for us to come up with, with solutions to the problems that are there. So I may sound like I'm saying contradictory things, right? I'm still overall very positive about the public space that's out there. I am concerned, because of the challenges of access to reliable information or lack thereof,
Hmm.
and the polarization that creates, some real challenges for us getting to a
Hmm.
point where we can find common ground and acceptable solutions.
Hmm.
But that's part of why I still want to be involved. I think
Hmm.
we people of good spirit need to be at the table, and
Hmm.
I'm not I'm not saying I'm the only person out there that can do the controller's job, but I think I can continue to contribute something, which is why I'm hoping to continue with this position for another 4 years.
Yes. Oh, and just you mentioned some of the challenges right now, just with social media and just some divide, but just looking towards the future of New York State, what gives you hope?
I mean, always I would say the people. I think the talent and the energy in New York State is very unique.
Hmm.
It's still the place people want to be. We do have an issue with, you mentioned the affordability and some people moving from
Hmm.
Long Island to upstate. We have some people moving from Long Island and upstate to out of state.
Hmm.
Um, it's not the stampede that critics say, but that it is an issue for us to look at and be concerned about. But I'm very hopeful in terms of what I see across the state. My concerns are that we have a lot of uncertainty with the economy, a lot of New York's fiscal strength, not all of it by any means, but a lot of it has benefited of late because Wall Street's been doing very well. I don't know if that's going to continue. I'm very concerned about the impact of the federal budget cuts that we're just starting to feel, certainly on healthcare particularly, but we're going to start to see more of the cuts in terms of SNAP, the food, what we used to call food stamps, nutrition
Hmm.
programs, energy programs, environmental programs, and so on. So I think New York is one of the states that, is adversely affected by those federal cuts, maybe more so
Hmm.
than some other states, particularly because we've been a generous state, especially on the healthcare side, the Medicaid program. And I think that creates a real challenge for us. So I'm hopeful because of the talent that I see across the state. I'm concerned because there are things that we don't control. We don't control federal priorities. And as the
Hmm.
federal government changes the relationship between Washington and the states, those impacts, at least in the short run, are not going to be favorable to us. And I think the economy, no one has a crystal ball, but
Hmm.
you have a lot of geopolitical challenges out there. The stock
Just
market.
I mean, I don't know if you could
Yeah.
talk about it, but just if you see long-term ramifications or effects from the war,
Well, I mean, I certainly see short term. I mean,
short-term.
obviously,
Okay.
for sure, short term in terms of the price of gasoline being an obvious
Hmm.
one. I think the tariff policies as well could have even longer term impact than they have already. I do worry from a budget perspective. Are we at a point where we're going to have to spend a lot more of our national, budget on defense? Will that cram out other priorities that are very, very important? I think that there's a lot to be determined based on what happens this year in the midterm elections and heading into the
Hmm.
next presidential election. I think I can't predict what's going to happen. Obviously, I have my party loyalty, so one could
Hmm.
get how I hope it goes. But that being said, I worry a little bit that we could have I don't think it's helped us to have one party in control of just about everything in Washington. The
Hmm.
other, downside, if we have divided government, perhaps nothing gets done. And that's another
Hmm.
concern. Because get
Yes.
back to what I was saying before, the ability of people to figure out how to find common ground and work together, it seems elusive, right? And
Hmm.
I still think, and I have very strong opinions, and I'm no magician. I'm not sure I could make things better if I was in Washington. And frankly, I never wanted to really, to be in Washington. I like serving at the state and local level. But there's got to be a way to still hold your partisan point of view and still figure out how to work together. That seems to not be happening. So,
Hmm.
in terms of the war in Iran, I think probably everyone, including the president, thought it was going to be a very short duration. Clearly, that's not the case. I don't presume to know what the end game will be, but
Hmm.
it's gone on longer than we would have thought, and so
Hmm.
obviously that has an impact in terms of spending. It has an impact as more Americans lose their lives, and that's obviously a great concern. Many New Yorkers care about what's happening in the Middle East and the lack of resolution, to so many of the issues there, separate from Iran, but as far as
Hmm.
Israel and the Palestinians obviously is a big debate point for many people,
Hmm.
and a lot of instability as far as the world picture. And while I think most Americans are supportive of Ukraine, again, that continuing to drag and what that means in terms of a global impact as far as the economy or American priorities as far as foreign aid, relationship with Russia, and the whole issue of the competition with China creates challenges. And I think the biggest issue, I know it's talked about a lot, and I'm not sure how it all plays out, but the continuing impact of artificial intelligence.
Yes.
One of the clear concerns, appropriately so, is what will it mean for the workforce? Most of the studies suggest that many of the entry-level jobs will be affected by this to the point that many of those jobs may be eliminated. So for many people, starting out in an organization, it often happens at a lower level, an entry level, then you work your way up. If you kind of take away those entry level positions, how do you find your path? And
Hmm.
especially when you look at the unemployment rates, especially for young people, especially for young people of color, where there's still some challenges there, will that dynamic and that change affect even more people? Or, frankly, for older workers that have put some time in, all of a sudden when they find out that they're not needed anymore, right? And that's not new. I mean, it's happened before in our history, impact of automation and so on. But AI
Hmm.
seems to be happening so fast
Hmm.
without us really fully understanding the implications. And then there's a lot about privacy, all the data now that's being collected on people, and what does AI do with all that data,
Hmm.
the algorithms and everything else. So, boy, oh boy, there's a lot out there to
It's a
be
lot of challenges.
a lot of challenges, a lot of challenges.
No, but I think just lastly, I think you have touched on this in the beginning with yourself getting involved in public service and government. But what advice would you offer the next generation of New Yorkers who want to make a difference? And obviously, we've talked about all these challenges we're navigating, but continue to be proactive and wanting to be involved in the community.
I mean, the first thing I'd say is step up, get involved, and do it from a place of optimism. I find so many people, young and old, are not as hopeful as I think perhaps I was, when I was a teenager. And again, the challenges are different today, but there are a whole lot of challenges when I was first coming of age. So
Hmm.
be hopeful, be positive, understand that in fact you can make a difference. I mean, I'm a kid from a working class family in Nassau County, grew up in a good Republican household, and yet I found a pathway in the Democratic Party to be one of the four statewide elected officials. Not because there's anything special about me, not because I had a whole lot of money or special connections. I just said I want to make a difference, and I took my lumps along the way. I didn't win every race I ran in, but I always sought out the opportunity and sought out the chance to build coalition with other people.
Hmm.
I think that's the other thing. I think people need to find their space, and a space that's shared with others of a like mind and a like spirit. And I think that's an important thing to do. I mean, again, for me, it happened to have been the Democratic Party. For somebody else, it might be the Republican Party, or it might be an advocacy group.
Hmm.
It might be the Long Island Pine Barrens Society, pick a
Hmm.
wonderful organization that always had a wonderful East End focus, or one of the land trusts, that are the Nature Conservancy. I'm sticking with
Hmm.
my environmental roots, but there are so many other advocacy issues around other issues, and causes. Engage at that level and then see where it takes you. But don't be afraid. Don't, so
Hmm.
many times young people say, "Oh, you need money to get involved in politics." No, you don't. You need to have your uncle be something. No, you don't. You have to have some
Hmm.
determination and optimism, and understand that our democratic system, small d democratic, only works if people are engaged in the process.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean it's always pretty or simple. It doesn't mean you always win, but the opportunity really and truly is there, and people shouldn't think otherwise. And certainly that has been my personal experience and it's my personal observation. And I certainly hope more young people will be. But I mean, one of the things that surprised me somewhat from when I first started is that more people, teenage years or 20s, weren't stepping up and getting involved. And I think we're
Hmm.
seeing a little bit of resurgence of that these days, but I just remember we fought so hard, for the 18-year-old vote, and yet in many years, the lowest voter turnout is sometimes those 25 and younger. I always find that
Hmm.
disappointing because we work so hard to get that vote for younger people, and
Hmm.
I think so, I think younger people, they don't realize that, they take for granted that you could be 18 and vote.
Hmm.
So,
No,
yeah,
definitely.
so I don't know, be optimistic, be determined, and look for people to connect. I mentioned Bob Mrazek, earlier,
Hmm.
right? He's someone who was one of my mentors. May Newberger, who was my predecessor, was a mentor. I worked for one session up in Albany right when I got out of college, my local assemblyman, Angelo Orazio. I was fortunate. I had a number of people along the way who were mentors. I remember when I first ran for school board. I was on the front page of Newsday when I won. And I got a call from a woman named Ann Weiland, who was the Democratic leader in the area at the time. And she said, "Oh, I see, you're a young person, you got elected. It's wonderful. Do you think you might ever want to get involved, in the Democratic Party?" And I was already an enrolled Democrat, but not particularly active. And that phone call resulted in a friendship that lasted for decades. And she was one of the big sponsors of me to run for office as a Democrat and be elected to the assembly. So look for people who could be mentors and
Hmm.
help to guide you and be allies. I'll mention one more person, only because she had a big influence on me, and she's still going strong at age 97. Lee Seaman, who was the local Democratic leader in Great Neck, and kind of adopted me when I moved to Great Neck. Look for those who perhaps have a little more experience or a little older, and folks you can learn from, and folks who can be your allies. I
Hmm.
think that's an important lesson that I learned along the way. No one person does it on their own. People say, "Oh, Tom, it's so great. You've been elected statewide and all that." I didn't do it on my own. I certainly didn't do it on my own. You don't be so full of yourself to think that, it's all about you. It's all about the
Yes.
team. It's all about the team that you surround yourself with,
Hmm.
and who you get guidance from and who you learn from. I've learned a lot from other people, sometimes from other people's mistakes,
Hmm.
but more often than not, from other people's successes.
Hmm. No, definitely. Thank you for saying that. I really agree with that. No, but this was a pleasure to have you on today. I really want to thank you for taking the time to come on and share your story as well as all the work you've done and continue to do in our community and throughout the state. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a great discussion, Chris. So next time I go out, 'cause Claudio still has, I know it's different ownership, but Claudio's is still there. So if I go out there again, I'll have to stop by the library.
Yes, no, definitely. That sounds great.
Great.
All right.
Thank you very much. It was a great discussion.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 241 with Tom DiNapoli. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library Podcast, and we'll see you next time.